Hey guys, I just wanted to share something that I'm working on. This is a chapter I call Emotional Coding, and here it is. I'll never forget where I was when I first heard the news. It must have been 5 a.m. when she told me. And when she first said it, I called her a liar. Half asleep, I told her she was wrong, that I just spoke to him last night, so she must be mistaken. That's when I hung up the phone and I tried going back to sleep. This was hours before the first day of my second year, and I did not have time for this. After getting off the phone, I closed my eyes and I laid back down, but I didn't cry. 2 days later is when all the calls really started coming in. Of course, this is back when people still called instead of texted, back when we still had flip phones. For almost 7 days straight, I felt like a clairvoyant. I knew everything people were going to say to me before they even said it themselves, and to prove my newfound power, sometimes, I even mouthed the words along with them, patiently waiting for my turn to be silent. Of course, I couldn't actually hear voices, more like everyone who called was reading off the same lousy script. We're so sorry for your loss. We know how close you two were. If there's anything we can do, don't hesitate to. These were like telemarketers, only worse. At least with telemarketers, you can be asked to be put on the National Do Not Call Registry, but not this week. No, I was forced to listen. Some kind of social contract. People brought me their tears, and then I regurgitated the details. Quid pro quo. I'll never forget the moment everything started to sound the same because I was sitting on the floor, staring through our beer-stained carpet when I noticed that even my own answers were starting to sound rote. Their impersonal canned responses were causing me to go into canned responses, and even though I was personally feeling the most confused I've ever felt in my entire life, I still knew what my next line was supposed to be. I was supposed to say, "Thank you for calling," but instead I improv this little bit where I threw my phone against the wall at 60 miles an hour. Most of my life I've had a rather calculated and logical disposition to being, but for this one brief second I completely let go of everything and gave into this deep well of unadulterated anger. The 4-year-old in me cried out, "It isn't fair," as he launched his phone into the wall as hard as he could. And after watching it shatter into a million pieces for the first time in a week, I was free. Destroying something gave me power in a moment when I had none, and for that one fleeting second, I chose what lived and died. Granted, the hole in the wall didn't fix anything, but the 4-year-old in me didn't care. He just wanted justice, to destroy something perfect. Really, he's the one who threw it. Me, I just picked up the pieces. If this, then that. Everywhere you go, everywhere you carry around the skull that houses your brain, you're coding, whether that be consciously or unconsciously. Whether you want to or not, your brain's constantly taking statistics, finding connections, and making associations. To put it bluntly, you're an unconscious learning machine. You're a conscious learning machine too, but since we're exploring the unseen spectra of consciousness, it's probably worth mentioning that beneath your sphere of awareness, your brain is consistently forming heuristics, confirming expectations, and because we're emotional creatures, that means making rules. When you get down to it, Ava used to say, most any computer program is just a long list of if this then that commands. If user presses A, execute code A693B, reward graphics and sound. If user presses B, execute womp womp womp.wave. And the picture we're trying to paint here is that human beings aren't that different, just complicated. In all honesty, we're making if this then that rules all the time, it's just we're not aware of most of them. Generally speaking, we only experience the aftermath. To explain what I mean, just think about the things that really drive human behavior. Food, sex, shelter, temperature regulation, social interaction, self-actualization, emotional well-being. These can all be likened to something like the driving forces behind our core code. Passed down to us through billions of years of evolution, these weren't bits of our psyche we had to consciously work out for ourselves. And yet there is a sense in which we get to code or interpret the way we feel about any particular experience, and it's this type of emotional encoding or interpretive encoding that I'd like to focus on now. One way to look at this life might be to say that we're an amalgam of every interaction we've ever had. And while most of these interactions are rather benign, leaving no impression at all, some of these interactions carry the potential of changing us in ways we can never forget, rewriting the rules of our source code, modifying the way we think and behave, potentially forever. You can think of these as being something like general rules of thumb the unconscious self creates to help guide future behavior. When a familiar but frightening situation comes back up, the code starts to execute. You're not thinking, you're on automatic. But in addition to the rules we create for ourselves, it's also worth noting that we're embedded in a complex web of societal rules. Being the social creatures that we are, humans are constantly putting themselves into contracts with other people. And whenever this happens, it's really only a matter of time before one of them winds up in physical or emotional danger. And as previously mentioned, the brain doesn't like to be in either, which often means that it ends up protecting itself in ways we can't even begin to imagine. Given that 95 to 99% of our cognitive processing is unconscious, this means that we're not even aware of most of the learning that shapes our behavior. To pick an extreme example, I'll never forget the first time a girl cheated on me. The suspicions leading up to it, the interrogations with all the friends involved. This is one of those multi-month betrayal episodes that could really rewrite the rules of who you were going to be for the rest of your life. So when the girl finally did tell me, after months of suspicion and question, I physically felt pain, like a black hole was collapsing in the center of my chest. Not many people lose 3 friends over the course of one phone call, but driving home that day, I sure did. After she finally confessed, I hung up the phone, completely taken aback by the depths someone would go to cover up their lie, and then I did the only thing I knew how to do. I destroyed something. I was driving home from school at the time, so naturally I started punching my steering wheel. Driving as fast as I was, I shouldn't even be here. But in that moment, nothing mattered, because all I really wanted to do was feel something else. So I punched, and I punched, and I punched. Even after most of the casing had come off, even after bits of the horn were flaking off into my lap, I kept slamming my fists down until the thing really broke, exposing the hard metal underneath. Needless to say, by the time the 5th punch came down, the jagged metal plate won that round and my hands started leaking out blood. Correction, pouring. I'll never forget glancing down, seeing my tendons and bone catching their first glimpse of sunlight, and then realizing the degree to which I'd fucked up. The knuckle of my middle finger took most of the damage, but apparently the cold metal had cut through the tops of my hands with such a force that it folded the skin back in on itself. Something like the dog-eared page of a book. This torn flap of skin, formerly known as my knuckle, was now tucked underneath the tops of my hands in a way that meant I could see bone. I remember seeing this, instinctively pressing my hand into my lap to stop the bleeding, and then pressing both feet in the brakes hard. My car screeching to a stop, my book bag slamming against the dash, pens flying everywhere. With my good hand, I rolled the wheel as far as it would go left. Pulling an illegal U-turn right in the middle of a highly trafficked road, I then floored it heading east. My right hand throbbing, leaking more blood into the stupid khaki pants our principal used to make us wear. I ended up driving myself to the hospital. Now whenever I look at my writing hand, I'm forced to stare at this big red hook of pink skin. A cute little reminder of the time I got exactly what I deserved. I hurt a girl and she hurt me back. But sadly, because I was 17 and stupid, on the way over to the emergency room, I started making myself all sorts of promises. Promises like, I am never going to end up here again. And to make sure I kept that promise, consciously and subconsciously, I began making up rules. Rule number 1, don't ever let a girl get close. Rule number 2, maintain your power at any cost. Rule number 3, don't punch things when you're mad. All of that actually happened, by the way. There's no hypothetical lens we're peering through on this one. That Friday I felt the kind of pain you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, and then I consciously made the choice to never feel that way again. If you ever end up loving a girl again, then never let her get close. My entire life's future reduced to one line of code. Black and white. Something a child might do. Write a little line of code that would protect a part of himself that died that day. Subconsciously, I probably concocted a dozen or so rules to help ensure I'd never end up feeling that kind of loss ever again, but honestly, I only remember the 3. And these rules actually worked too. That is, until the fall semester of my sophomore year came around and my best friend took a turn going 90. That's when I had to make up another rule. Never let yourself have another best friend. Because if you never let yourself have another best friend, what are the odds you'll have to deliver 2 soul-crushing eulogies? Was this a good rule to have created? None of the dozen rules I created the day someone puts 13 stitches in my hand or the night I called my mom a liar were rules for living. These were rules for surviving, and surviving isn't living. Sure, these rules might have helped me withstand the initial pain of the incident by giving me some kind of emotional roadmap for how to carry on, but they kept me distant and closed off for years. The point is, things happen to us. We live life, we get hurt, and then we make promises to ourselves. Whatever else happens, we tell ourselves, I'm never going to end up here again. But instead of dealing with the pain directly, we make contracts with the future, promises we couldn't possibly keep. Instead of being honest with ourselves about the kind of pain we're in, we bury it and deflect. Instead of discharging about how we really feel with friends or a trained professional, we inflict our pain upon others. Personally, I retreated, which is really just a fancy word for ran away. Instead of facing my problems forthrightly and potentially resolving this deep hurt, I drank beer and smoked a bowl, the adult version of sucking your thumb. Self-medicate ought to be one of those terms you have to explain to people, and yet it's such a common practice, everybody knows what you're talking about. Considering this method of coping, is it really so surprising that for the next 6 years I didn't have a best friend? I mean, how could I? I wouldn't let myself. Now I want to pause for a second to point out something, which is, this wasn't something I was consciously doing. In fact, it's only because of hindsight, time, and an altered state of consciousness that I'm even able to look back and retrospectively analyze my own behavior. So when that day did finally come, the day I realized why I was the way I was, why I kept people at a distance, why I had trouble making guy friends, I realized because it was deep down, I was scared. So afraid I was going to get hurt, I didn't dare let anyone in. Subconsciously, my friend's death was still operating me. Now it's a story, but it used to be my story, if that makes any sense. A piece of pain I unconsciously clung to the way a kid clings to a blanket. Left to our own devices, human beings will run away from almost anything, and despite what the cute little saying says, time does not heal all wounds. Only truth does, which includes being honest with yourself. That day, standing behind the pulpit, the 4-year-old in me promised himself, whatever else happens, I'm never going to end up here again. And he kept it. But sadly, that meant James was going to be closed off and bitter. That he was going to inflict his pain upon others. That somehow, in a Machiavellian sense, he was going to get his justice. Growing up where I grew up, crying was somehow seen as less human. You couldn't be a boy that cried. You could be a girl or a Nance, but you couldn't be a boy that cried. Apparently, those things were mutually exclusive. The perceived wisdom of the time was girls cry, men got angry. Turns out nature's pressure release valve was only sanctioned for use by women and children. This is one of those societal rules your dad either taught you real young or you figured out the hard way. The perceived wisdom was detach and avoid, ignore and repress, confront a bully, ignore a feeling. Of course, you could be the one who tried to challenge the status quo. But all that would amount to is you finding out just how savage a pack of 9-year-olds could be. There was a societal contract in place, and it's always been that way. Who are you to change things? Girls cry, men got angry. That was the deal. From the dugout, you could hear the kids preaching the gospel. Walk it off! Get up! Sure, you might be paralyzed on the ground with the wind knocked out of you, but you could still hear them parroting back all the wisdom they'd absorbed. Come on, get up! Their prepubescent voices starting to harmonize. If you were lucky, the coach would run over to you and tell it to you straight. Look, he says, there's people watching. Between his teeth, he says, come on, get up. The line drive to your chest didn't hurt that bad. Come on, get up. So you do. You stuff it down. You take your base. What else can I say? That's life. Girls feel, men deal. The moment after everything started the same is the moment I decided to flip the script. The moment after the girl tells me everything happens for a reason, I pull the phone away from my face and just stare at it. 12 inches away from my face, and I can still hear this voice say, look. She says, I know how you feel. But instead of saying thank you for calling, which is what I'm supposed to say, I leave the phone open and lean back on one leg. Twisting my torso, I pull my right arm back as far as it goes, and like a rubber band, I snap. I pitch the phone against the wall as hard as I can, and I follow through. Coach would have been proud. Hurtling at 60 miles an hour into our shared townhome wall, I watch as my only connection to the outside world explodes into a million pieces. A piñata of drywall and plastic. Then I clench my fists and scream so loud I break my voice. The light fixtures shake, the neighbor's dog barks, but still, I don't cry. Finally going over to the hole in our townhome wall, I snatch up the biggest pieces of drywall first. Them I chuck in the trash can just as hard. The rubber keyboard, the plastic antenna, I shove all that shit in my good hand. Bending over at the waist, I grab up all the small shards of glass with just my bare fingers, but those really tiny bits just keep running away from me. Every time I reach for them, it's like they keep moving deeper and deeper into the carpet, escaping my every grasp. I'm bent over so long I'm starting to see stars. Next thing I know, my face gets all hot and my nose is starting to run. Determined to get the last pieces of glass, I go to wipe my nose with the backs of my hand, but when I do, a huge breath falls out of me and I have to turn my head. An image of my friend flashes in my mind and there's so much pain I have to shut my eyes and scream. Only when I go to scream, nothing comes out. What's worse, no air is going in either. I'm completely frozen, unable to speak or breathe. Finally collapsing to the ground, I'm able to catch a breath, but when it goes in, something's wrong. It's all staccato, something like a reverse laugh of breath, followed by a sound no man's supposed to make. And even though there's no one home, these chalky hands still have to come up to hide my broken face and the shame of a man who can't keep it together. After finally letting myself feel the loss of my friend with the deepest part of my soul, I drop everything I'm holding and take my place on the floor. There, on the ground, I cry for 20 minutes straight. That is emotional coding.